I heard them celebrating my potential death through a baby monitor. The fluorescent lights in Methodist Hospital's cardiac wing buzzed like dying insects, casting that particular shade of institutional yellow that makes everyone look like they're already halfway to the morgue. My hospital gown scratched against my skin as I shifted on the narrow bed, the fabric rough as sandpaper, probably washed in industrial bleach 1,000 times. The heart monitor beside me beeped steadily, marking time like a metronome, counting down to something I couldn't yet name. My phone screen glowed in the dim room, showing 11:47 p.m. 3 hours since the chest pains had doubled me over in the produce section of Kroger. 3 hours since the ambulance ride that tasted like fear and antiseptic. 3 hours since they'd called David to tell him his 63-year-old mother was in the emergency room with what the doctor carefully termed a cardiac episode. He hadn't come. The notification sound chimed soft as a church bell, and Facebook's blue icon appeared at the top of my screen. Melissa had tagged me in a photo. How thoughtful of my daughter-in-law to remember me during what she surely knew was a medical crisis. I tapped the screen, my finger trembling slightly from whatever cocktail of medications they'd pushed through the IV line. The image loaded pixel by pixel like a Polaroid developing in reverse. David sat at the head of my grandmother's mahogany dining table, the one Tom and I had inherited 40 years ago, the one we'd refinished together in the garage that summer when David was learning to walk. My son's face was flushed with laughter, his mouth open mid-sentence, telling some story that had clearly delighted his audience. Melissa glowed beside him in the chair where I used to sit every Sunday after church, her auburn hair catching the light from the chandelier I'd picked out at an estate sale in 1987. 12-year-old Chloe, my granddaughter, was frozen mid-giggle, her small hand covering her mouth the way children do when they've heard something wonderfully scandalous. The table was set with my good china, the Spode Christmas pattern Tom's mother had given us as a wedding gift. 3 place settings. Only 3. They were in my house, eating off my plates, sitting in my chairs, occupying the space I'd created and maintained for 4 decades. But I wasn't the one who'd been excluded. According to the timestamp, this photo had been taken 23 minutes ago. 23 minutes after Dr. Martinez had used words like stress-induced and monitoring overnight and we've contacted your emergency contact. The caption beneath the photo hit me like a physical blow. Finally, a day without the drama queen family dinner is so much more peaceful. Blessed, drama-free Passer family time. 47 likes already. My sister-in-law Nancy had commented with 3 crying laughing emojis. Tom's cousin from Memphis had added a heart. Melissa's book club friends were chiming in with, "Looks delicious and such a beautiful family." I stared at that screen until the letters started swimming together, my reading glasses forgotten on the nightstand at home, while I'd been lying on a gurney with electrodes stuck to my chest, while strangers in scrubs had debated whether the widow in room 314 was having a heart attack. My family had been celebrating my absence. Not worried, not concerned, not even guilty. Celebrating. The taste in my mouth was metallic, now copper pennies and old fear. My thumb hovered over the phone icon next to David's contact information. I could call him. I could ask why he wasn't here, why he'd chosen dinner over his mother's potential cardiac emergency, why Melissa thought my medical crisis was the perfect opportunity for social media humor. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years of living in a 1-bedroom apartment while they occupied the 4-bedroom house Tom and I had bought in 1982. I called Barbara Henderson. Eleanor. Barbara's voice was sharp with concern despite the late hour. At 70, she'd been selling real estate longer than most agents had been breathing, and she understood that calls after 10 p.m. meant someone's world had shifted off its axis. "Are you all right, honey?" "Barbara," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, how clear my thoughts suddenly were. "Remember that house on Maple Street you said would sell in a week if I ever decided to list it?" A pause. The sound of papers rustling, probably property sheets, she kept organized in manila folders that smelled like coffee and determination. "The 4-bedroom colonial you've been letting David's family use, Eleanor. It's nearly midnight. Are you sure you want to discuss this now?" I looked again at Melissa's post, now up to 53 likes and growing. Someone had shared it with their own caption, "Goals. Sometimes you need a break from difficult relatives." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. "How fast can we get it listed?" The silence on Barbara's end stretched long enough that I could hear the hospital around me coming alive with night shift activity. Soft-soled shoes squeaking against linoleum. The distant sound of a television playing infomercials. Someone crying 2 rooms down. "Eleanor," Barbara said finally, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in real estate and a lifetime of watching families tear themselves apart over property and pride. "What happened?" I took a screenshot of Melissa's post, saving it to a folder I'd never thought I'd need to create. Evidence. Then I turned my phone face down on the scratchy hospital blanket and closed my eyes. "I finally saw the truth," I said. "And tomorrow we're going to do something about it." The morning brought coffee that tasted like dishwater and a discharge nurse who kept calling me sweetie in that tone reserved for children and the elderly. My chest felt tender where the monitors had been attached, small circular bruises blooming like dark flowers against my pale skin. The cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, had delivered his verdict with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen too many stress-induced episodes in women my age. "Go home, reduce anxiety. Follow up with your primary physician." What he hadn't said, but what hung in the sterile air between us, was that women in their 60s were expected to have stress-induced heart palpitations, expected to be fragile, overwhelmed, prone to dramatic overreactions to normal family dynamics, expected to be the problem. Barbara was waiting in the hospital lobby, her silver hair perfectly styled, despite the early hour clutching a manila folder thick enough to stop a bullet. At 70, she moved with the purposeful energy of someone who'd learned that time was finite, and wasting it was a sin. Her blue eyes, sharp as winter mornings, swept over my rumpled clothes and disheveled appearance with the calculating assessment of a woman who'd built a 30-year career on reading people's desperation. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, which was why I'd always liked her. But determined. That's good. Determined sells houses. We drove through Riverside in her pristine Buick past neighborhoods where I'd lived my entire adult life, past the elementary school, where I'd volunteered in the library, past the community center, where Tom and I had taken ballroom dancing lessons in what felt like another lifetime. The October morning was crisp enough to make my breath visible, autumn painting everything in shades of ending. "Before we go any further," Barbara said, pulling into the parking lot of Mel's Diner, "I need to know what we're really dealing with. Property law gets complicated when family's involved, and that post you showed me last night suggests there might be some ugly dynamics at play." Inside Mel's, the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee created a haze that clung to everything like yesterday's mistakes. We settled into a corner booth, red vinyl cracked enough to show the foam beneath. Barbara spread documents across the scarred Formica table with the efficiency of a surgeon laying out instruments. "First question," she said, pulling out reading glasses that made her eyes look enormous. "Is your name still on the deed?" "Of course it is. Tom left me the house free and clear." "Good. Second question, and this one's harder. Have you been getting all your mail, bank statements, property tax notices, credit card offers?" The question hit me like cold water. "David and Melissa have been helping me with mail since Tom died. They have it forwarded to their address so I don't get overwhelmed with paperwork." Barbara's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Eleanor, when was the last time you actually saw a bank statement?" I tried to remember. The months after Tom's funeral had been a blur of casseroles and sympathy cards, people telling me what a good son I had, how lucky I was that David was so willing to help with the difficult business of widowhood. Maybe 6 months ago, Melissa said she'd handle the financial organizing so I could focus on healing. Healing. Barbara repeated the word flat as roadkill. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through something that made her frown deepen. Eleanor, I need to ask you to do something that might be uncomfortable. I want you to call your bank right now and ask them to read you your most recent statement over the phone. Why would I need to do that if there were problems David would have told me? The look Barbara gave me was the same one she'd worn when explaining to young couples that their dream house was 3 payments away from foreclosure. Patient, but with an undertone of urgency that made my stomach clench. Honey, indulge an old woman's paranoia. Just call. 20 minutes later, I was staring at my phone like it might bite me. According to First National Bank, my checking account showed regular deposits from Tom's life insurance annuity, but also withdrawals I'd never authorized. Large withdrawals. Monthly transfers to accounts I'd never opened. There must be some mistake, I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. Barbara was already dialing another number. Patricia Morgan. It's Barbara Henderson. I need you to meet with a client today. Yes, I know it's Saturday. This can't wait. Patricia Morgan turned out to be the kind of lawyer who wore power suits to weekend meetings and charged enough per hour to make most people reconsider their problems. She met us at Barbara's office, a converted Victorian house, where the smell of old wood and fresh ambition created an atmosphere of quiet competence. Eleanor. Patricia said, settling behind Barbara's desk with the natural authority of someone accustomed to taking charge. I've been practicing family law for 25 years, and I've seen this pattern before. Before we discuss your options, I need to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. She pulled out a laptop that looked newer than anything in my apartment. Let's start with your credit report. What appeared on that screen made the heart palpitations from the night before feel like a gentle flutter. 3 credit cards I'd never applied for, all showing my address as the house on Maple Street, all showing recent activity, all showing balances that made my retirement savings look like pocket change. Eleanor. Patricia's voice was gentle but relentless. Did you authorize anyone to apply for credit in your name? The room started spinning. No, never. I haven't applied for a credit card since Tom died. The oldest of these accounts was opened 18 months ago. All 3 show the same authorized user, David Hartwell. Your son has been using your Social Security number and credit history to fund what looks like a significantly elevated lifestyle. Barbara leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades, watching families destroy each other over money. Eleanor, this isn't just about the house anymore. This is identity theft. This is felony-level financial abuse. Through the window, I could see families walking to the farmers' market downtown, parents pushing strollers, children clutching balloons, normal people living normal lives where sons didn't steal from their mothers and daughters-in-law, didn't celebrate medical emergencies on social media. What does this mean? I asked, though part of me already knew. Patricia's expression was grim but determined. It means we're not just listing a house, we're building a criminal case. And Eleanor, if they've done this much damage while you were unaware, there's probably more we haven't found yet. She was right. By the time we'd finished pulling financial records, the full scope of the theft had emerged like a tumor under X-rays. $78,000 in fraudulent credit card charges. A home equity loan I'd never signed for. Store accounts, gas cards, even a jewelry store credit line that had funded what looked like an engagement ring worth more than my car. All of it traced back to the house on Maple Street. All of it authorized by David acting as my power of attorney under documents I'd never seen, let alone signed. The systematic nature of this suggests extensive planning. Patricia explained printing page after page of evidence. Mail redirection, forged documents, careful timing of major purchases. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was calculated exploitation of your trust and grief. Barbara gathered the papers into neat stacks, her movements sharp with barely contained anger. Eleanor, I've been selling houses for 30 years, and I've never seen financial abuse this sophisticated. They didn't just steal your money. They built an entire false financial identity around your name. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Mom heard you were in the hospital last night. Hope you're feeling better. We're here if you need anything. I showed the message to both women. Patricia read it and laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. That, she said, is what we call establishing a paper trail of false concern. He's creating evidence that he's a caring son worried about his mother's health right before we expose him for stealing her identity. What do we do now? I asked. Barbara smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something predatory in her expression. Now, honey, we stop playing defense and start playing offense. And the first thing we're going to do is make sure they never see it coming. The key to everything Patricia explained as we sat in her law office that Monday morning was documentation. Not just the financial records we'd already uncovered, but creating a paper trail that would establish my competency, my awareness, and my deliberate decision to take action. The pattern we're seeing suggests they were building toward a guardianship petition, she said, spreading photos across her desk like tarot cards predicting a dark future. Look at these social media posts from the past 6 months. She'd printed screenshots from Melissa's Facebook account, a curated gallery of family happiness that told a very specific story. In photo after photo, I appeared confused, disheveled, or absent entirely. David and Melissa looked patient and long-suffering, the kind of adult children who bore the burden of caring for a difficult, aging parent. Here's Christmas dinner. Patricia pointed to an image where I sat slightly apart from the others, my expression vacant, my hair uncombed. Notice how you're positioned in the frame, classic visual narrative of isolation and confusion. I remembered that day differently. I'd been grieving Tom's first Christmas absence, struggling to find joy in traditions that felt hollow without him. But through Melissa's lens, my grief had been reframed as mental decline. Easter brunch. Patricia continued showing another photo where I was caught mid-sentence, my mouth open, my eyes slightly unfocused. And here's Chloe's school play where you're standing alone in the back while they sit together in the front row. Each image had been carefully selected and captioned to reinforce the same narrative. Eleanor Hartwell was becoming a burden, a woman whose grip on reality was loosening, whose family was heroically managing her decline. This isn't accidental social media sharing, Barbara said, studying the timeline with the sharp eye of someone who'd seen every variation of human deception. This is building a case. Every post, every caption, every carefully chosen photograph was designed to establish your incompetency in the court of public opinion. But why? The question felt stupid even as I asked it. If they wanted my money, couldn't they have just asked? I would have helped them. Patricia's laugh was bitter as black coffee. Eleanor, they didn't want help. They wanted control. If you had voluntarily given them money, you could have stopped giving it. If you had willingly signed over power of attorney, you could have revoked it. But if a court declared you incompetent and appointed David as your guardian, you'd have no legal rights left, no ability to make decisions about your own life, your own money, your own future. The scope of their plan was breathtaking in its cruelty. While I'd been mourning my husband and trying to figure out how to live alone, they'd been orchestrating my complete legal and financial destruction. The good news, Patricia said, pulling out a recording device the size of a matchbox, is that we can use their own tactics against them. Eleanor, how comfortable are you with wearing a wire? 3 days later, I stood in the foyer of my former home, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and furniture polish, fighting the disorientation that comes from visiting a place that used to be yours. They'd redecorated since my last visit. The wallpaper Tom and I had chosen together was gone, replaced by something Melissa probably saw in Southern Living. My grandmother's mirror had been moved from the hallway to make room for a contemporary art piece that looked like someone had sneezed paint onto canvas. Mom? David appeared from the kitchen, arms outstretched, his smile bright enough to power a small city. You look wonderful. How are you feeling after your little hospital scare? Little hospital scare, as if my chest pains had been nothing more than indigestion from eating too fast. I'm fine, I said, letting him hug me, while the recording device Patricia had taped to my chest captured every word. Thank you for your concern. Melissa emerged from the living room carrying a coffee service on the silver tray that had been my mother's, playing the perfect hostess in what used to be my home. She was wearing a dress I didn't recognize, something expensive looking that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. "Eleanor, you seem much calmer today," she said, pouring coffee into cups I'd bought but rarely saw anymore. "We were so worried when we heard about your episode." Episode. Another diminishing word, as if my medical emergency had been a theatrical performance. "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately," I said, accepting the coffee and noting how Melissa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "About making sure my affairs are in order." David leaned forward, and I could practically see the dollar signs reflecting in his pupils. "That's very responsible, Mom. Very mature. Maybe we should talk about updating your will, making sure all your financial planning is current." "Actually," I said, pulling out the manila folder Patricia had prepared, "I've already taken care of most of it. I wanted to show you the documents my attorney helped me prepare." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the antique clock on the mantelpiece, the one Tom had inherited from his father, ticking away seconds that felt heavy as stones. Melissa was the first to speak. "Your attorney, Eleanor, we've discussed this. You don't need to waste money on lawyers when David can handle everything for you." "Patricia Morgan is very reasonable," I said, watching David's face pale at the mention of one of the city's most prominent family law attorneys. "She's been helping me understand my legal rights as an elderly person living independently." "Mom?" David's voice carried a note of warning I'd never heard before. "You're not thinking clearly. The stress of Dad's death, living alone, your recent health problems. Maybe you should let us handle the complicated stuff until you're feeling more like yourself." There it was, the narrative they'd been building delivered with surgical precision. I was confused, overwhelmed, not thinking clearly. They were the responsible adults trying to protect me from my own poor judgment. "Funny thing about thinking clearly," I said, pulling out the credit card statements Patricia had helped me obtain. "It turns out I've been thinking more clearly than anyone realized. For instance, I've been wondering about these accounts that were opened in my name without my knowledge." I spread the papers across the coffee table like a winning poker hand. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, then something that looked like panic, before settling into the practiced innocence of someone who'd talked his way out of trouble his entire life. "Mom, those are household accounts for maintenance and expenses on this house. Since we're taking care of your property, it made sense to streamline the financial management." "Household expenses," I repeated, pointing to a line item that made my stomach turn. "Like this $8,000 vacation to Mexico that I apparently took last December. Strange, because I spent Christmas alone in my apartment while you told me you were keeping things low-key this year." Melissa's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "Eleanor, you're misunderstanding the paperwork. These are complex financial instruments that require professional interpretation." "You're absolutely right," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt with hands that weren't shaking anymore, "which is why I've asked Patricia to review everything with a forensic accountant. Such interesting people, forensic accountants. They can trace every transaction, every forged signature, every unauthorized use of someone else's identity." The room felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. David stood up too, towering over me in a way that might have been intimidating if I hadn't spent the past week learning exactly what my legal rights were and how to protect them. "Mom, you're being manipulated. This lawyer is taking advantage of you, filling your head with paranoid fantasies about your own family." "David," I said quietly, "the police would call it elder abuse." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. In the distance, I could hear Chloe playing in the backyard, her laughter a bright counterpoint to the darkness spreading through the living room. Melissa recovered first her voice, taking on the soothing tone of a nurse dealing with a difficult patient. "Eleanor, let's not say things we can't take back. You're upset, you're not thinking rationally. Why don't you stay for dinner? We can work this out like a family." I gathered my papers and put them back in the manila folder, each movement deliberate and final. "Actually, Melissa, I am thinking rationally, more rationally than I have in 3 years." I walked to the front door, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors. Tom and I had refinished during our first summer in this house. Behind me, I could hear urgent, whispered conversation, the sound of people realizing their carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "Mom," David called after me, his voice desperate now, "don't do anything you'll regret. We can fix this. We can work it out." I turned back one last time, looking at my son in the doorway of the house where I'd raised him, where I'd taught him right from wrong, where I'd believed I was building a foundation of trust and love that would last a lifetime. "David," I said, my voice carrying across the distance between us like a final goodbye. "The only thing I regret is that it took me 3 years to realize what you really thought of me." As I drove away, I could see them in the rearview mirror standing on the front porch of my house, probably making plans for damage control. But it was too late for plans. The recording device had captured everything they'd said, every excuse, every attempt to gaslight me into believing I was confused and incompetent. By the time I got home, Patricia already had a transcript prepared and criminal charges drafted. The war they'd started with a social media post was about to become a battle they couldn't win. The criminal complaint was filed on a Wednesday morning that felt like the first day of the rest of my life. Patricia walked me through the courthouse steps past reporters who'd caught wind of what one news outlet was calling the Facebook elder abuse case, their cameras clicking like hungry insects. Detective Sarah Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of seeing the worst things people do to each other. She sat across from me in an interview room that smelled like industrial coffee and broken promises, reviewing the evidence Patricia had assembled with the methodical precision of someone building an airtight case. "Mrs. Hartwell." Detective Chen said, flipping through bank statements and credit reports, "In 20 years of investigating financial crimes, I've rarely seen fraud this sophisticated. Your son didn't just steal money. He created an entire parallel financial identity using your personal information." She pulled out a timeline that made my chest tighten. "The mail redirection began 3 days after your husband's funeral. The first fraudulent credit application was submitted 6 weeks later. The systematic social media documentation of your supposed decline started approximately 4 months after you moved out of the house. They planned this from the beginning," I said, though saying it aloud still felt surreal. "The evidence suggests extensive premeditation. But Mrs. Hartwell, there's something else we need to discuss. During our investigation, we've identified other potential victims." Detective Chen opened a second file, this one containing documents I didn't recognize. David's previous living situation was with an elderly relative, his great-aunt Margaret Hartwell. She died 18 months ago at age 84, leaving her estate to charity rather than family. The attorney handling her estate found irregularities in her financial records during the months before her death. The room started spinning. "Are you saying they did this before?" "We're investigating that possibility. Mrs. Hartwell, your decision to fight back may have prevented other elderly people from becoming victims of what appears to be a systematic pattern of exploitation." 3 hours of questions later, I walked out of the police station feeling like I'd been turned inside out and examined under fluorescent lights. But there was something else, something I hadn't expected: pride. For the first time in 3 years, I'd stood up for myself. I'd refused to accept their narrative that I was confused, dramatic, or incompetent. The house listing went live that afternoon. Barbara had worked her magic staging it with rental furniture that made every room look like a magazine spread. The photographs captured 40 years of careful maintenance and loving improvements, though they couldn't capture the memories that lived in every corner. My phone started ringing immediately. David called 17 times from different numbers after I blocked his cell. Melissa sent increasingly frantic text messages, ranging from pleading to threatening to offering bizarre justifications for theft. But the call that changed everything came from Jennifer Wells, Melissa's sister in Seattle. "Mrs. Hartwell, I saw the news coverage about the charges. I need to tell you something about Melissa that I should have mentioned years ago." Jennifer's voice was shaking, carrying the weight of guilt and delayed conscience. 15 years ago, Melissa did something very similar to our grandmother. Grandma Rose was 82, completely sharp mentally, but she had savings and owned her house free and clear. My blood went cold. What happened? Melissa moved in to help after Grandma had a minor fall. Within 6 months, Grandma was showing signs of confusion, forgetting things seeming more frail. Melissa convinced the family that Grandma needed professional care. She got power of attorney, moved Grandma into a nursing home, and took control of all her finances. How much was stolen? Jennifer's voice broke. Everything. $200,000 in savings plus the house. By the time Grandma died 2 years later, there was nothing left. Melissa claimed it all went to medical expenses, but the numbers never added up. The family was too grief-stricken to investigate thoroughly. I sat down hard on my couch, the phone trembling in my hand. "Jennifer, why are you telling me this now?" "Because I kept some of Grandma's financial records, things that didn't make sense at the time. And because when I saw what happened to you, I realized we enabled Melissa's first victim by staying silent. I won't do that again." That evening, Patricia called to inform me that Jennifer's information had expanded our investigation. The forensic accountant had identified a pattern of behavior spanning more than a decade, with at least 3 elderly relatives who'd suffered unexplained financial losses while in Melissa's care. Eleanor, this case has become much larger than personal theft. We're looking at potential serial elder abuse, with multiple victims across several states. Your courage to fight back has opened a door that may bring justice for people who died never knowing they'd been systematically robbed by someone they trusted. The weight of that responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't just about my hurt feelings or stolen money. This was about preventing other families from experiencing the betrayal and financial devastation that had nearly destroyed my life. The house sold in 4 days, multiple offers all above asking price. The buyers were a young couple with twin toddlers who fell in love with the mature trees and solid construction. They had no idea they were purchasing evidence in a criminal case that would eventually span multiple states and result in legislative changes to elder abuse protection laws. David and Melissa had 10 days to vacate. The eviction notice served by the sheriff's department cited their status as occupants without legal standing, rather than tenants with rights. Patricia had been thorough in establishing that no legitimate lease agreement existed, no rent had ever been paid, and no legal basis for their continued occupancy could be documented. The morning they moved out, I drove past the house one final time. A rental truck sat in the driveway, and I could see figures moving behind the windows, packing up the life they'd built on stolen foundation. Part of me felt sad for the grandson I'd loved, the little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap during family movie nights. But that little boy had grown into a man who celebrated his mother's medical emergencies on social media while systematically stealing her identity. Love doesn't excuse theft. Family doesn't justify fraud. And my grief over what we'd lost couldn't protect other people from what they might do next. 18 months after filing charges, I stood in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and decades of difficult decisions. David sat at the defendant's table, wearing a suit I probably paid for without knowing it. His head bowed as the judge read the terms of his plea agreement. "Mr. Hartwell, you have pleaded guilty to identity theft, financial fraud, and elder abuse in the first degree. Do you understand that these charges carry a potential sentence of 15 years in state prison?" "Yes, Your Honor." David's voice was barely audible. "The court accepts your plea agreement. You are sentenced to 2 years in state correctional facility, followed by 3 years probation and full restitution in the amount of $127,000. $127,000. The final tally of everything they'd stolen, every fraudulent charge, every forged document, every penny they'd taken, while I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, believing I was helping my family." Melissa received 18 months of community service and supervised probation after her attorney argued she'd been following David's lead. But Jennifer's testimony about their grandmother's case made that argument less convincing than it might have been. The investigation that started with my case eventually led to charges in 3 other states. Aunt Margaret's estate was able to recover nearly $80,000 that had been transferred to David and Melissa's accounts in the months before her death. 2 other elderly relatives who died with suspiciously depleted assets were identified as potential victims, their cases now being reviewed by prosecutors in Virginia and Florida. What surprised me most about the sentencing wasn't the legal consequences, but my own reaction. I didn't feel vindicated or satisfied. I felt tired and sad and oddly empty. Watching my son be led away in handcuffs, I wasn't thinking about justice or revenge. I was remembering the toddler who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard, convinced he was giving me the most beautiful flowers in the world. But there was something else, something I hadn't expected: relief. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the problem. I wasn't dramatic, demanding, or confused. I was a crime victim who'd fought back successfully, and that made all the difference. The house proceeds, combined with the restitution payments, gave me enough money to start over completely. I bought a small cottage in Asheville, North Carolina, where the mountains reminded me that some things are permanent and beautiful and can't be stolen by people who've forgotten the difference between love and exploitation. Chloe lives with me now. The custody hearing revealed that David and Melissa had left her with friends or relatives during at least 6 weekend trips, including the Mexico vacation and several other getaways funded by fraudulent credit cards. The judge was unimpressed with parents who prioritize luxury travel over their child's inclusion in family activities. She's thriving here. New school, new friends, and most importantly, adults who don't lie to her or use her as a manipulation tool against other family members. She's in therapy, as am I. We're learning how to have honest relationships after surviving systematic deception. The most satisfying development wasn't financial, though. It was watching their carefully constructed narrative crumble under scrutiny. Every person they'd convinced I was becoming incompetent had to confront the reality that I'd successfully navigated complex legal proceedings, real estate transactions, and criminal prosecutions. You don't accomplish those things if your mental faculties are impaired. I volunteer at the Regional Elder Abuse Prevention Center, now helping other people recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. It's heartbreaking how common these stories are, and how often the abusers are family members who exploit trust and love for financial gain. The center keeps statistics that would curl your hair. 1 in 10 Americans over age 60 experiences some form of elder abuse. Financial abuse is the most common type, and in 70% of cases, the perpetrator is a family member. The average victim loses $36,000, but many lose everything. What makes me angriest isn't what happened to me, but what I see happening to others. The widow whose daughter-in-law convinced her to sign over power of attorney, just in case, then immediately moved her into a nursing home and sold her house. The retired teacher whose grandson used his identity to rack up credit card debt, then disappeared when the bills came due. The veteran whose daughter systematically emptied his bank accounts while telling neighbors he was developing dementia. These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a culture that treats elderly people as disposable, as burdens to be managed, rather than human beings deserving of respect and protection. Every time someone's family dismisses their concerns as drama or confusion, another potential victim loses their voice. Sometimes people ask if I regret how everything turned out, if I wish I'd handled things differently. The answer is complicated. I regret that it took me 3 years to recognize what was happening. I regret that I enabled their behavior by accepting the temporary arrangement instead of setting clear boundaries from the beginning. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret refusing to accept their narrative that I was dramatic, demanding, or incompetent. I don't regret protecting my granddaughter from parents who were more invested in funding their lifestyle than caring for their child. David calls occasionally from prison, usually when he wants something. Money for commissary help with his appeals process, or intervention with Chloe, who rarely accepts his calls. I keep these conversations short and civil, but I don't pretend we have the relationship we used to have. Some trust, once broken by systematic betrayal and theft, can't be fully repaired. What I have now is something I'd forgotten was possible peace without apology. Real peace, not the fake kind that comes from avoiding conflict at any cost, but the deep satisfaction of knowing I refuse to be anyone's victim. The cottage has a garden where Chloe helps me grow tomatoes and herbs. We have dinner together every night, real conversations where no one's checking their phone or planning their next manipulation. She's teaching me to use Instagram not for curated family photos, but to document our actual life homework sessions at the kitchen table, failed attempts at baking cookies, movie nights where we fall asleep on the couch. Last week, she made a sign for her bedroom door that reads, "No drama queens allowed." Smart kid. She learned early that the people who call you dramatic are usually the ones creating all the drama. As I finish writing this, I can hear her practicing violin in her room, the notes floating through the house like birdsong. Tom would have loved hearing music in these rooms again. He would have been proud that I finally learned to fight for myself, though he probably would have done it sooner and with fewer tears. The sun is setting over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and purple that remind me why artists come to places like this to find inspiration. Tomorrow, I'll drive to the Elder Abuse Center to meet with 3 new clients who think their families are stealing from them. I'll help them understand their legal rights, connect them with resources, and most importantly, assure them that they're not crazy, not demanding, not dramatic. They're crime victims who deserve justice, protection, and the knowledge that their voices matter. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to disappear quietly. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is simply refusing to pretend it didn't happen. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give other people is showing them it's possible to fight back and win. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.